Good evening. In the year 2009 and 2013, America experienced what scholars are sure to view as one of the most historic elections of our time. Not only did America choose its first Black president, it did so with astounding voter participation. 8 years later, another presidential election took place with substantially less voter turnout. Reasons and theories abound: manipulation, disenfranchisement, apathy, and interference among them. The 2016 presidential election ushered in one of the most polarizing periods in the history of the United States for workers who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. As of today, over 9 million people in the United States have been infected by the COVID virus. Among 230,000 have died. Almost 230,000 have died. One day last week, the death toll matched that of 9/11. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the essential workers in the front line, bear the brunt of COVID fatalities and economic deprivation. Will their voices be heard during the 2020 presidential election, an election that is destined to be another watermark in American political history? I am Gaston Pearce, distinguished lecturer and executive director of the Workers' Rights Institute at Georgetown's Law Center. Formerly, I served as the chairman of the National Labor Relations Board during the Obama administration. I am honored to be sharing this program with Professor James C. Benton, director of the Race and Economic Empowerment Project, a part of Georgetown's Kalmanovitz initiative for labor and the working poor. Professor Benton is a historian who studied labor history and ways in which organized labor has been affected by trade policy, economic change, and industrial decline from the New Deal to the present. He has a forthcoming book, Fraying Fabric: How Trade Policy and Industrial Decline Changed America, which I hope he will speak about at some point in our conversation. If people have any questions, please place them in the Q&A as the chat will be disabled. Greetings, Professor Benton.
Good evening, Mark, and thank you very much for the introduction. Also, thanks to the Workers' Rights Institute for hosting today's event, and good thank you to all the participants who decided to take time out of your schedule to watch and weigh in on the discussion that we are about to embark. Do we want to go ahead with a description of how this is going to unfold?
Well, yeah, I would like, if you would, give a historical backdrop as to how race and workers and voter suppression connect with each other, the correlation. Okay. It's kind of interesting because what had happened is that during the course of my few occasions where I decided to think deeply, I said, well, you know, there is a correlation that we all obviously know, but can we articulate it?
Right.
And I said, well, for me to really be able to make the case, I'm going to need somebody who has a very good perspective on that, and that's why I embraced you in that regard.
Got it. So, all right. Well, let's go ahead and get started without any further ado. The discussion, the historical background that I've prepared deals a little bit with workers' rights since emancipation in the 1860s and goes through to the present. There are also some political changes that have taken place in that period that have real significance for tonight's topic. This is not an unabridged description. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about this. So I may skip over a few things, but fortunately with the conversational style and the format of tonight's event, we have an opportunity to really go back and discuss these things in a free-flowing manner. So if you would, go back to emancipation in 1865, when roughly 4 million enslaved people in the United States are freed after the Civil War. Even then, there is a debate going on about workers' rights, because now you have this group of newly emancipated people, and there's a fight over how to integrate this group economically within American society. And the debate boils down to two things. Freedmen wanted land redistribution as the means of earning a living. And the Freedmen's Bureau, which was created after the Civil War, actually did have the power to redistribute lands. But landowners and politicians feared and opposed land reform as part of emancipation. And this debate wound up, unfortunately and sadly, creating some of the abuses that follow chattel slavery and create what I call an unfree type of labor that exists down to this very day. What comes out of that debate is the use of sharecropping or tenant farming system. And this was a somewhat of a compromise between planters and former enslaved people, or even white yeomen. And what that does is it gave the planters a guaranteed source of labor without having to lock in contracts which the freedmen wanted. The freedmen, in exchange, gained a limited degree of control over performance of work, their hours, and some conditions of labor. However, this balance was stacked in the favor of planters, because that arrangement was tied to this oppressive credit system, and it contributed to a long-standing economic dependency that prevented the freedmen from becoming truly free as laborers, and also locked the planters into this system by which they had to maintain a subservient class. So those things really weigh upon each other as we go forward from the 1860s on into the 1900s.
The freedmen couldn't really own the land, could they?
What's that?
The freedmen didn't own the land, did
they? They did not own the land, but now in some cases people were able to purchase and farm lands. Sometimes they were marginal lands. Very, very rarely would they be prime farming land. And unfortunately, if a person became successful at farming, that made them a target for ostracism. That made them a target for violence and sometimes being driven off the land. After roughly in the 1870s, you get the rise of the exoduster movement, where groups of African Americans go to places like Kansas and later into Indian Territory, which becomes Oklahoma, to set up independent Black communities, which they saw as a refuge from the extra legal violence that accompanied Reconstruction and the redemption period that followed. So really, sharecropping creates this monoculture, and in which you have a decline in Black land ownership because of the violence and ostracism and things like that. But also farmers, the tenant farmers missed out on the agrarian reforms, the Populist Party, things in the 1880s, 1890s that brought Black and white people together politically for a very short time around reforms that would help farmers and working people move up through society. But the sharecropping is also important because it helps create this racially based power structure in the South. And here's where one of the political components come into play. When you have redemption in the 1890s and on through the civil rights era, the section of the civil rights era that concludes in 1965 with the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, you have this political disfranchisement that takes place, where states across the South really actively drive African Americans out of the right to vote. And that has a meaningful conclusion because it paves the way for the election of members of Congress, state legislatures, and so forth. Let's focus on members of Congress. It creates a system by which, by the 1930s, which we'll get to in a little bit, the chairs of many of the committees in Congress are, whenever Democrats hold power, are generally run by Southerners who have built up this seniority. And the seniority is based on disfranchisement because it cuts down the number of people who can vote for politicians, and it reinforces that system that's in place. So we're going to see how that affects things in the New Deal especially, but I want to lay the groundwork here. You get other types of abuses that arise in this period going back to the late 1800s, when the United States goes through a period of industrialization. That too has some hazards for workers. Workers are forced to work long hours. They have low pay that can't keep up with their living expenses. They face dangerous conditions and economic instability as well. And to top it off, there are few, if any, government interventions between workers and employers. They really work to keep workers in a very precarious economic position. We know some of that nowadays with talks about the precariat and how the gig economy has made workers very unstable, and how jobs that don't pay a living wage have created this instability. Well, the same types of things existed during this period of rapid industrialization. And it makes for a number of unfree labor practices like peonage, debt servitude, kind of like what you see in sharecropping, but it's employed against manufacturing and construction workers. It's employed against workers who build the railroads. It's used in convict leasing, which is a practice that begins before the Civil War, but picks up steam afterward. And what I mean by convict leasing is the use of over-policing, arresting people on charges, fining them amounts that they cannot pay, and then an employer comes along and says, I'll bail this person out of jail if that person can work for me to work the debt off. And they are brought into these conditions where, again, things are dangerous. They don't pay enough for paying off the fine, much less the living expenses they incur. And sometimes when conditions are dangerous, these workers, their health and their very lives are at risk. So it's a very insidious type of danger that workers are finding themselves in.
Slavery by another name.
Slavery by another name. And with whether it's called sharecropping, whether it's called debt peonage, whether it's called convict leasing, whether it's on the farm, whether it's in the factory, whether it's on the railroads, it's targeting immigrants as well as Native people, but African Americans do suffer disproportionately from these practices, especially convict leasing and sharecropping. But you have, during this period, I almost have to say that we have different types of resistance. Workers don't just take it, as we know, as students of labor history or people who are familiar with labor history and workers' rights. We know that in this period there was significant amount of organizing. There were strikes. There were efforts at political participation that include things like the populist movement, which I mentioned back in the 1890s, Coxey's Army in 1894, which is a march from Ohio to Washington of groups of poor people who were and workers who were striking for their rights. You have the formation of unions in this period during the late 1800s, such as the National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, and eventually the American Federation of Labor.
But you also had scenarios where oppressed ethnic groups were pitted against each other. You had the what was it, the draft strike during the Civil War, where the Irish in New York and several places in the East Coast were pitted against African Americans.
Yes.
And African Americans were lynched on Fifth Avenue.
Mm-hmm. And that interethnic conflict continues from the 1860s. The National Labor Union had tried to break this barrier. There was a leader named William Silvis who tried to get people to say, look, white workers and black workers, they have similar aims, let's get them together. But the people he was organizing would have none of it. And to top it off, Silvis died in 1869 at the age of 41. So his leadership was cut short. Mm-hmm. And the National Labor Union, as a result, excluded black workers, excluded immigrants. Black workers founded a colored National Labor Union, but they were never able to unify around their common interests. And then as you get into the 20th century, you find the common practice of employers playing on this division and using African-American workers in many cases as strike breakers, because the unions would either lock out or not want to have black people as members, fellow members. Managers and company officials saw that and played upon it, and that thwarted a lot of what could have been I don't know if it would have been ultimately successful, but if people had gotten past that very significant barrier, who knows what could have happened with workers. But still, you had strikes, roughly 37,000 between 1881 and 1905, that involved about 6 million workers, coal, railroads, Pullman porters, all this. Many of these were met with violent resistance and put down by either military or by armed agents of the state, such as the Pinkerton Private Security Unit, which was involved in the Homestead strike as well. So
one person asked whether, in your opinion, does convict leasing in any form still exist today?
Well, Doug Blackman in his book, which now is a little bit dated, it's about 2010, 2011, I believe. He pinpoints the end of convict leasing at just during World War II. And the reason he draws for that is because the United States was headed to or involved in World War II. And the idea behind ending this practice, which the Attorney General was involved in, Francis Biddle, was because they wanted to make sure that they not only ended the practice, but that they projected to the world an image that was more favorable, because they were trying to project this image in contrast to the Axis powers. But does it exist today? I would say you could see elements of it in our agricultural system, especially when it involves migrant workers who are coming in from out of the country, who have their, if they have passports or other legal documents taken from them, and they are held against their will. There's some who would argue that this type of unfree labor is a type of convict leasing.
Sure.
It really depends in the eyes of the beholder.
It's even more direct in that prisoners are making furniture that is being sold to the federal government, and they're making clothes and that is for private industry, and
yes.
And they're certainly not being paid a minimum wage. In fact,
I certainly forgot it. I forgot to mention that too. But yes, like you're saying, prisoners and workers with disabilities. If you think of, not to pick on any certain nonprofits, but you may see an ad on TV from time to time of a nonprofit that prides itself on helping workers with disabilities become independent, or differently abled workers become independent. Well, those workers don't get paid minimum wage because they're exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, just like prisoners are exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And if you think about the forest fires out in California, the inmates who fight fires on behalf of California Fire,
right,
they are not making minimum wage. And only until recently were they were ineligible for the jobs as free people on the outside that California Fire was all too willing to use them for when they were locked up. So the answer to that question is, you could say it really does still exist. It's a matter of what your definition of unfree labor is, and the types of conditions under which these workers are existing. So, but yeah, so let me finish up a little bit here and get us into the present. One of the things that workers continue to face as an opposition in the late 1800s, late 19th century, was this hands-off approach by the federal government. Capital held much more power. The state was weaker. There were these legal philosophies and laws that really advantaged the worker, advantaged the employer over the worker. And one of those I want to bring up because, now that we've had this confirmation for Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, before that and in the past couple of years, there's been this talk about whether the legal doctrine of Lochnerism would come back. And for those who are watching who might not know what that is, that applies to a roughly 40-year period, 1897 to 1937, where Supreme Court rulings tended to favor employers in lawsuits or cases involving laborers. The term here that comes to mind is freedom of contract, meaning the idea was that the worker individually had the freedom to contract with employers and vice versa, but not collective bargaining. So there could be they struck down minimum wage laws, they struck down federal child labor laws. And finally, it was with one case in 1937, West Coast Hotel v. Parrish, that Lochnerism finally came to an end. And now with Barrett on the Supreme Court, and also with the general pace of labor law, there's been a lot of talk that this doctrine could be making a return at some point. So, so some of the legal protections that shift in workers' favor come about as a result of the New Deal. And many of you may know some of the key laws, such as the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which enshrines the right of workers to form an independent union and collectively bargain with that employer. That originally started out as the infamous or famous Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933, a law that was struck down by the Supreme Court a few months before the Wagner Act was enacted in Congress. You also had the termination of what are called yellow dog contracts, which is basically a pledge by a worker not to join a union, an independent union, as an employee. And that was done in 1932. And then in 1938, with the regulation of wages and hours through the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the 40-hour week and the first official minimum wage, which was then 25 cents an hour. And so you had these
based on Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent in Epic Systems, yellow dog contracts are back into business, it seems, since you have to sign away your right to be able to file a group grievance or a class action arbitration.
Yeah. So it's not a perfect system, and even with these advancements in law, there were still uneven protections. Many agricultural workers were not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Many of them weren't covered until 1966, and they still remain ineligible for overtime. Domestic service workers were not covered. Most of them were not covered until 1974. So you could have millions of workers who were outside the reach of the protection of these types of laws. And nowadays with tipped employees, you can still see elements of that, because the wages for a tipped employee has been set at $2.13 an hour since 1996. So that's the hourly wage plus whatever tips they earn. And we're still at that rate nearly a quarter century later. So, I talked earlier about how voter suppression plays a role. Well, a lot of the New Deal legislation that gets through only because you have members of Congress who are cutting out basic populations. And one of the arguments around the Social Security Act, for instance, in 1935, was that it was okayed as long as it did not include agricultural or domestic workers. And that, in one stroke, eliminated a lot of African-American workers from eligibility for Social Security, which they only got in, like with the Fair Labor Standards Act, they only got access to decades after the Social Security Act was on the books. So the protections are there, but their reach is uneven. Millions of workers are left outside the protections, and some of that has to do with voter suppression and the effect on the types of politicians who get affected, or who get elected rather, and what deals they drive to secure legislation. So let me wrap up a little bit, and then let's go forward. I want to take you from World War II down to post-war period. Additional protections during World War II included a no strike pledge, a national war labor board that protected workers' rights and helped balance wage increases and costs for contracts, that sort of thing. And those two things, between the National War Labor Board and the federal government's encouragement of unionization, plus the Wagner Act, which we know is partially responsible for the great wave of industrial organizing that took place in 1937 and 1938, helps union membership reach about 12.5 million workers by 1945. And that was an increase of about 3 million workers from 1941, when the US entered World War II. Though union density would continue to increase throughout until the mid-1950s, erosion set in right after World War II. You had the Taft-Hartley Act, which was enacted over President Truman's veto in 1947. That was done in response to strikes and economic instability during the early days of the post-war era, when the country was converting back to a civilian peacetime economy. And that the effect of that was many states and places with weak unions, or places that did not want unionization, enacted right to work laws. And that coincided with a union drive, a labor drive called Operation Dixie, which was aimed at organizing large swaths of industries across the South. And unfortunately, that fell victim to race baiting, red baiting, economic threats, the unwillingness of people in power or workers to really positively respond to the opportunity to be part of a union. And those things help explain, in part, not entirely, but in part, why there's such low unionization even to this day in places like the Carolinas and other states across the South. Another erosion that's really significant is the erosion of the Wagner Act itself, either through neglect or through the lack of legislative fixes in Congress. There's also willful violations of law by employers. Employers refuse to bargain with workers who go through the steps necessary to form unions. And then with capital mobility, you get workers organizing unions, and employers in retaliation closing plants, and far outside the reach of the federal government. There's a case that I'm fascinated by, where workers organize a union at a textile mill in South Carolina. And in return, this was in 1956, the workers, in retaliation, the company closes the plant. The workers sue, the case goes to court, it goes to federal court, it goes to NLRB, it goes to the federal court, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's finally resolved with payments to the workers, and in about a third of the cases, in payments to the estates of the workers, because this entire legal journey took 25 years. The organization took place in 1956. The case was not finally resolved until 1981. And that's a key example of how companies decided just to willfully violate the law, and the law was not strong enough to force a remedy in a faster amount of time. And that
by design,
type of erosion.
By design.
Yes. By design.
Mm-hmm.
And coming around the bend here, one other thing that also has an effect on as an erosion. I mentioned union density. It begins to decline after the 1950s, but it gets a boost from states, and then in the 1960s, the federal government opening up collective bargaining for public sector employees. Unfortunately, in 1981, when roughly 11,000 air traffic controllers go on strike, the PATCO strike, President Reagan fires them. This union had won benefits and increases, pay increases, improved conditions for its workers. It had used job actions to force the Federal Aviation Administration to bargain. But when they struck in 1981, which was illegal, and President Reagan fired them, not only did he break that particular union, but he also, by firing the workers, really put a stake through the heart of the use of the strike as a tool that workers could use to improve their conditions. It also set in motion the increased use of strike replacement workers. So this is a key erosion that I think has to be taken into account over the past 45 years or so. Well, almost 40 years, because that was 39 years ago. So you have weakening laws, you have things like the PATCO strike, you have the decline of manufacturing, which is not only affecting plants and industries, but it's affecting unions because they're fighting for conditions that are being undercut by companies saying, well, if I don't want to pay you $20 an hour, I can move to El Salvador and pay $2.50 an hour, or I can move to China and pay 36 cents an hour. I can move to Vietnam and pay 9 cents an hour. Now let me go back and weave in the African American and racial components here. The move to unionization during World War II really helps African American workers, both in the industrial unions and throughout the war industries, gain a foothold into some sort of economic security. And therein is the basis for a deepening of an alliance between organized labor and civil rights groups, some of which you can go back to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. You can start there. You can come forward through the National Negro Congress, the CIO unions, the United Auto Workers, and not only their support of African American rights and into discrimination, but there's a move that they all make toward improving conditions for workers. You have women in organizations like Dorothy Height and the National Council of Negro Women. You have women in the United Auto Workers and their auxiliary units. You have workers in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who are all pushing for improved conditions that women need in terms of job conditions and into discrimination, opening up jobs for people who had been left out of those sorts of jobs, that sort of thing. And that civil rights labor alliance is at the forefront of things like pushing for the Voting Rights Act. And that too has a means of opening up political participation in places across the South, but in the nation in general. However,
let's not forget that A. Philip Randolph, who is almost the personification of civil rights and labor rights in my mind, and you mentioned Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was the president of that, and he was also active in the AFL and never went to the CIO because he did not believe in communism.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, it was his ability to create the movement and the intersection of labor rights and civil rights that he was able to finesse and use his bargaining ability to be able to negotiate an executive order that provided Black people the opportunity to get hired without discrimination in defense industry.
Yep. Executive Order A802.
Right.
His
Exactly right.
March on Washington movement, which threatened to put 100,000 people on the streets of Washington, and Franklin Roosevelt said, "Nah, we'll do this." so those are all good sorts of things.
Right.
Now, in the early 21st century, I had mentioned earlier the gig economy. And there have been efforts, like in 2004, the Fair Labor Standards Act was amended to reclassify low-level managerial employees as executives in a way to take away their eligibility for overtime. Other employers have classified workers as independent contractors, so they're exempt and beyond the reach of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Companies like FedEx have faced lawsuits where workers allege that the company unilaterally classified them as independent contractors, responsible for things like their uniforms, the condition of the trucks they drive, all those sorts of things. And through it all, there's been, unfortunately, this trend by which employers are increasingly violating the law, the wage and hour laws especially. And instead of a fast resolution, they tend to lead to longer legal fights. And the resolution either comes out as a modest fine for the employer that equates to a cost of doing business, or a dragged out resolution that really doesn't help the worker who is affected over time. So in conclusion to some very long remarks, and my apologies for that, we're in this place now where, and it sounds cliche, but we could either go forward or we could go back. And what I mean by that is we can see areas where opening up political opportunities and opening up political access has led to better working conditions, and we've seen examples where those advances have been halted or even rolled back. And where do we go from here? I mean, we're in the home stretch of an election that is going to probably determine to some degree where we will wind up. The trend has not been promising, but there have been some encouraging points, and I just want to lay a couple of them out here. The fight for 15, Red for Ed, with teachers fighting for better conditions and better pay. The Bargaining for the Common Good, which is an organization in which workers, public sector workers, sit down at the table. They talk about community needs, not just basic bargaining over wages and hours and work conditions, but they bring in conditions that the community has demanded to win contracts and to also build allies with the larger community. These are all important developments that are continuing the work that labor unions have done to expand rights for workers, to protect rights for workers, and to seize change, positive change for workers. But we're still facing some tough times here. Union density last year, 2019, roughly 10.3%. So maybe 1 of every 10 workers in this country is a member of a union. 33% of all public sector workers are members of unions, but only 6.2% of workers in the private sector are members of the union. Now, with the pandemic and the economic crisis that we've been confronted with in 2020, unions are beginning to get a little bit more attention, a little bit more love from the general public. But will that change, will that translate into additional support? Will that translate into additional fight for workers' rights? That remains to be seen. So, you know, we're at this point where we face a lot of decisions, a lot of work that needs to be done. I feel like it's encouraging, but we face a good number of daunting challenges. So I'll leave it there, and thank you for the opportunity to give that bit of an overview.
Sure, sure. If I could, I'd like to bring it up a little bit into more contemporary times and talk about current trends. And James, if you would, please feel free to interject your observations on what I have to say. Sure. And I do remind the audience that you're welcome to ask questions as we go along, and we'll try to answer them on the fly as best as we can. The first thing that we all need to understand about the intersection between low-wage workers and people of color is getting an understanding of what that definition is. What does it mean by being in the working class? It seems, depending on who's talking, a definition that is either expansive or pretty narrow. The Cambridge Dictionary defines working class as a social group composed of people earning low pay and often compensated by the day or the hour, and often engaged in manual labor. Karl Marx defined the working class or proletariat as those who sell their labor power for wages and who do not own the means of production, like the land or the factories. The Bureau of Labor Statistics observes that different definitions which factor wage cutoffs or educational level as the criteria to determine who is the working class or who is a low wage worker, kind of leaves different demographics out depending on its focus. The Economic Policy Institute study defines working class simply as people with less than a bachelor's degree. And while that definition is succinct, it certainly does not take into account privilege. Certain famous college dropouts like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Frank Lloyd Wright certainly were not the working class and probably never were. But for purposes of this discussion, let's go with the API's current demographics. While Black, Indigenous, and people of color make up 40% of all working families in the United States, they account for 58% of low-income working families. The poverty rate of Black and Hispanic people is close to 3 times that of whites. Women, people of color, and those with low levels of education are the most likely to stay in low-wage jobs. Based on the long-term labor force projections from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the continuation of trends in college completion among different demographic groups, the working class is projected to become the majority people of color in 2032. People of color, low-income workers are less likely to vote, according to a study. And that's because of barriers, whereas whites are less likely to vote because of a lot of different factors, including cynicism and frustration with the economics of the political elite.
Right.
Tweedledee and Tweedledum, you know, a pox on both their houses, whatever.
But it's not a barrier that's been imposed.
Exactly right.
It's done by closing polling places or relocating precincts or cutting down on the number of machines in a voting precinct.
Exactly, exactly. In fact, economics is a high barrier. The voting rate amongst people earning $20,000 a year or below is at 47% compared to the 80% of those making $100,000 a year.
Hmm.
Now, so-called voter apathy, as you touched upon, James, may in reality be an inability to break through external barriers. Suppression is wrongfully swept under the term voter apathy as it takes the form of lack of civic education in schools. Who was it that used to teach civic education prior to now? It was either taught in school or it was taught by unions when there was a lot of union density. They taught what happens when you vote an issue and you vote in unison on the issue, what kind of power comes from that.
Mhm.
All of that is gone.
Yeah.
Inflexible work and school schedules that prevent citizens from having time to vote. Voting means lost time. And for a worker paid by the hour or a gig worker paid by the task or ride, that means lost earnings.
Yeah.
Lack of childcare and transportation, registration, administrative problems. And I'll get into the registration piece a little bit later in the discussion. Then, as you pointed out, sudden closing or changing of a polling place. You might have had a polling place that was convenient to you dropping off, voting, and going to job. And then all of a sudden, that polling place is across town or you can't find it.
Right.
Long lines, lack of seats for voters, elderly voters, short amount of time in which to cast your ballot, and you have lines that are going around the block, and we're seeing that now.
Yeah.
Understaffed and untrained election boards where folks are there really not knowing exactly how to handle the crowds.
Mm-hmm. A lot of this has happened since 2013 with Shelby County v. Holder and the Supreme Court basically invalidating the protections in sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which section 5 is the pre-clearance section, and section 4 is I want to say it's the jurisdictions that are covered according to the formula in section 2. So it's
and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because since 2013, when the Voting Rights Act was gutted, 23 states have adopted some form of suppression law.
Yeah.
That holding came 1 year after African Americans voted at a higher rate than whites in the presidential election, 66.6% versus 64.1% for the first time since 1980, when the Census Bureau began measuring that statistic.
Yeah.
By 2016, African American participation fell to 59.6%, while white participation rose to 65.3%. These changes reflected the impact of voter suppression.
Yeah.
The same states that have the most voter suppression efforts also host the greatest denial of health care and the denial of living wage, the highest rates of incarceration, and disproportionate imprisonment of people of color, and the highest rates of child poverty. Coincidence? I don't think so.
So with all those things, I want to bring in a question that one of our attendees has asked, which is the declining unionization in the southern states and across the US generally. Do you think a more widespread and concrete establishment of the connection between labor rights and civil rights would lead to higher societal confidence in and desire to protect the right to join a union, specifically in the private sector? And I want to pause for a second and talk about this, because there are there are activists out here like it was the Moral Monday movement. Now it's the Poor People's Campaign and other affiliated groups within that coalition that have talked about some of the issues we're raising here tonight. They're talking about poverty. They're talking about access to healthcare. They're talking about access to civil rights. They're talking about access to worker rights and improving those things. And there's a long tradition, especially in the South, of working toward building labor rights and civil rights together, not just among African Americans, but also among Latinos, among different populations. What this is running into, unfortunately, is a type of prejudice. In writing my book, but also in just studying labor history in general, you come up into these situations where workers, white workers, Black workers, Latino workers are all facing the same problems, and yet will not get together because in the cases I studied, which were in the textile and apparel industry, management was sending around letters saying things like, well, you know, your Black coworkers are starting to form a union and you don't want to be part of that because you don't want to be part of something that's run by Black people, would you? And it sounds comical, but the whole idea of being in something led by African Americans really touches a nerve with people. And if we think this is some long ago thing, if this was textile workers in 1970s North Carolina, let's talk about Nissan in 2018 in Mississippi, where workers were trying desperately to get folks to come together to eliminate a two-tier system at that plant in Canton, Mississippi. And they ran Nissan, and local people started running ads claiming that they were going to turn, the UAW was going to turn Mississippi into Detroit, or that the people who were going to vote for the unions didn't know what they wanted, that they were not thinking clearly, that they were being misled by some outside interest. So it's, you know,
a little bit more than a dog
if
whistle.
we're going to get to a place where, what's that?
A little bit more than a dog whistle.
Yes, yeah, more like a bullhorn. I mean, so if we're going to get to a place where there's higher societal confidence in the right to join a union and desire to protect it, we've got to get away from this idea of this racialized idea that people have capitalized on, and we're seeing it also in the pandemic, where when Mitch McConnell says he doesn't want to give money to blue states because it's going to fund government workers, when people say they don't want to give support to the Postal Service because they don't want to aid postal workers. Well, guess what? Who's one of the largest employers of Black people in this country? The Postal Service. That's right. What's one of the largest sectors of working class people of color? Public sector. And so when you start talking abstractly about cutting taxes and efficiency in government and not funding those workers, not funding public sector workers because they're in blue states, you know, what you're saying is we don't want to give money to to governments because they employ a disproportionately high number of Black people, or they employ a disproportionately high number of people of color and women. And, you know, so if we're going to get to a point where
if you superimpose what the Supreme Court did in the Janus decision with respect to taking away unions' abilities to charge union dues to people who the unions are expending resources to negotiate fair contracts for, is another example of taking the power away from a significant portion of the American public that happens to be Black and brown.
Right.
Um,
And this is why I get concerned, because we see cases like Janus, and we see moves that chip away at collective bargaining and atomize the relationship between employer and employee to the point where, you know, we can see it and go, you know, could we have a return to this Lochner era where they totally dismantle it? I hope not, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to try it. so so that's my concern, and that's one of the reasons I decided to highlight Lochnerism tonight, because or today, because the way things are going, we may need to have a familiarization with that period in American history, because it may be coming back sooner than we think.
Sure. Now, you know, when you think about the external structures of voter suppression, there are a lot of things that have been presented to us as fairly benign. For example, the whole act of registering to vote. Now, registering to vote, what is exactly the purpose of it? When you look at all of the rationales for registering to vote, you have to conclude, well, this is here because it presents something administratively that helps to marshal statistics or to regulate the crowd as they come through the door. However, if you don't register to vote, you lose your ability to exercise your right. And the rationale that has been presented for registering to vote run into questions like well, we have to pre-identify eligible voters, which would obviate the need to show ID. Yet so many states are requiring voter ID in any event. Pre-identification of political party membership.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that necessary? Quite frankly, when you assert your political party membership, you just make the assertion. You can assert that at the poll. There's
Right.
no like a DNC card or a GOP card that exists. And then other rationale like voter education, providing statistics to these polling entities, nothing that has anything to do with somebody's right to vote. And then what do you have is voter registration laws that vary drastically from state to state and often contain cumbersome registration, re-registration processes that serve to suppress votes. Example, Minnesota is among 21 states and DC that allow same-day voter registration. You go in there, you say, okay, I'm not registered, but I want to vote. Okay, you can register right now and you can vote. Tennessee requires voter registration to be a month ahead of time, and you got to present a picture ID when you get to the poll. Georgia, Wisconsin, Ohio will purge voters from their registration list because they have not voted recently. Yep. Where does it say that you have to continue to vote in order to have the right to vote? The National Voter Registration Act requires that certain states and local agencies offer voter registration, motor voter laws, where the DMVs or the public assistance agencies offer SNAP, Medicaid, et cetera, with a voter registration. But this is often underfunded, not fully implemented, and oftentimes ignored, particularly when the process is an opt-in process rather than an opt-out process. If increased voter participation was truly the goal, why wouldn't the U.S. Take a page out of some of these countries like Sweden, where it's virtually automatic enrollment in the system, which tracks every citizen's name, address, birth, and marital status? It's not like we can hide anyway these days. In Australia, voting is compulsory. And of course, I'm not an advocate of requiring people to vote, Parenthetically, there's some people that were glad to choose not to not to vote. But the bottom line is what they do is they automatically register people to vote. If somebody changes locations, they know where they are, and then they'll adjust their voter registration accordingly, which makes a lot more sense. Now, there's other barriers to voting, and we've been talking about that significantly during this time period, and that is restrictions on workers to unionize is a voter suppression tool. There's a study by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation that talks about restrictions on unions decreasing voting rates. Their research demonstrates that the hits union membership have taken over the years has a direct impact on voting. Together, the existence of right-to-work laws and the absence of collective bargaining rights for public employees were associated with a nearly 5% lower voter turnout. These findings suggest that legal instruments that weaken labor unions diminish unions' ability to mobilize voters. And that's mobilization, the key. And of course, race is a factor, as we talked about. The structure of the National Labor Relations Act. We talked about the Social Security Administration, how in 1935, they specifically excluded Black and brown people and domestic workers from the Social Security Act. But eventually, they got the message and they brought those categories of employees in.
Yes.
The National Labor Relations Act never did.
Let me point out here, just for the viewers, when Social Security was enacted in 1935, only about 31% of the American workforce was covered. However, 27% of white workers were excluded. 65% of African American workers were excluded from Social Security, and then 66% of others, what the Social Security Administration calls Native American, Latino, and Asian workers, were excluded from this act. So you have this, it's imperfect in its coverage, but the impact is disproportionately felt among workers of color. And you know, that's one of the things I wanted to convey here in this forum, that you know, the protections can be created, but they're not perfect, and people are left out. And just as worker protections leave people out, we have I lost my train of thought. Just as worker protections leave people out, we have political exclusion that leaves people out. You know, you were talking about all the different limitations. Right. Certainly, and we find ourselves as a country, not individually, but we find ourselves really just embracing them blindly. The felon disenfranchisement, for instance, that a handful of states still practice. That's been a big fight in Florida for the last couple of years, especially since voters overturned it, only to find that the legislature that couldn't find a solution before that amendment was passed suddenly found ways to put roadblocks in the way after 2018. A lot of people seem to think that there's no problem with barring convicted felons from voting. You know, to hell with rehabilitation. That's the way we've always done it. But then they don't realize that it was done in such a way to particularly exclude a type of voter.
Yeah.
Typically would be an African American man.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So,
and in fact, it's underscored in the new Jim Crow, the book, and in the documentary 13th, disenfranchisement, I brutalized that word, is another shackle.
Yeah.
One in 13 African Americans of voter age is disenfranchised, a rate more than 4 times greater than non-African Americans.
Yeah.
Over 7.4% of adult African American population is disenfranchised compared to 1.8% of non-African American populations.
Mhm.
That's a lot of people not being able to vote.
Yeah.
Now that amendment in Florida would restore the rights of felons only if they had completed the entirety of their sentences, including paying court fines and fees,
Mhm.
which sounds like a poll tax.
Sounds like a poll tax, and also those records are kept at the county level, and in many cases, people who have done every requirement that has been asked of them cannot figure out how much they owe, and yet and as a result, they're left in a limbo. They can't register to vote because if they do and try to vote, they may be accused of violating a law and then thrown back into jail for illegal voting.
Right.
So there's no way the state can reasonably tell them how much they owe, and they haven't been able to get a judge to write off the debt or to say, you pay the amount that we see and that's it. So it's very.
Well, I applaud Mike Bloomberg, who has been doing his part by using his billions to pay off these court fees and fines in certain key areas. Of course, he's strategically doing it in areas that would most benefit the candidacy of particular candidates. But that's at least something is being done in a positive way in that regard, where, as you say, these ex-felons would never be able to find their way towards being able to get their enfranchisement back.
Mm-hmm.
So how about this for a general question? Why should workers even register to vote? Given all of these obstacles, why should the effort be made? My view is that otherwise elected officials have little incentive to address low-wage worker issues at all. Mm-hmm. A recent survey of 1,200 low-wage workers in swing states found that 87% of the respondents said they were motivated to vote in this election. Significant majorities of workers polled also said they were in favor of measures like requiring companies to offer paid leave, instituting predicted work schedules. If going bankrupt, they should require to pay severance to workers first and protect their 401ks. The majority of respondents said they favored policies like Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, and breaking up corporate monopolies. Mm-hmm. But the respondents did not heavily favor Democrats. According to the poll, the respondents were only somewhat more likely to say they supported Democratic congressional candidates over Republicans. Similarly, with 49% of respondents saying that they were going to vote for Biden in November. Yeah. But what is clear is bread and butter issues are very important to these respondents. And if they saw clear an agenda that met their economic needs, they would vote accordingly.
Yeah. I would answer your question, your hypothetical question. Why should workers even register in this way? You know, you think back. If you want to go back to 2008, if you want to go further back, the whole idea of voting has been held as this ideal, but it's a flawed ideal. And many times we discuss voting as though that is the sum total of what citizenship means in this country, that it's the end point. And we should vote because we should register to vote because that's not the end, that's not the ultimate and highest use of our effort as citizens. It's the beginning. That we should be able to vote. We should be able to, petition for redress of grievances. We should be able to protest in the streets. Whenever we're fighting wrongs, those sorts of things. And voting is the beginning point of that. It is not, oh, I voted and go home and I'll see you in a couple of years. And people wonder why we have populations out here like African-American populations who say we don't see a politician until election time comes around, and they show up at church and they say, we're going to do this and we're going to do this. And they get on stage and they shake hands with the minister and they dance a little bit. And then they get back in the bus and they're gone, and you don't see them again for another couple of years. Mm-hmm. Register, you register and you vote because that's the beginning of writing the legislator. That's the beginning of going to the legislator's office. That's the beginning of going to the legislator whenever that person has events and getting in that person's face and saying, hey, I wrote you this letter. I want you to do this. And you haven't answered, or you're still
accountability,
still half-stepping. Yeah. What are you doing? Right. Come on. So I'd say we do it because it's the beginning, not the end.
Yeah. We have a question here. How does redistricting relate to voter suppression? Typically in low wage at Black communities.
Oh, I see that as restructuring.
Restructuring. Okay.
Yeah. So that's okay. It's redistricting. Sorry, it is redistricting.
You can have my
all right. The technology is we're catching up to the technology finally. Okay, so how does redistricting relate to voter suppression? There are many practices that the Voting Rights Act was intended to address. I talked about Section 5, which is the pre-clearance thing, which is whenever people move, when a county or a city moves a precinct or changes district lines, they had to go get approval from a federal court here in DC or the Justice Department. Shelby County versus Holder threw all that out. And that's why you had such a rush toward these voter ID laws and changing of precincts and closing of precincts, especially in states and localities that were under the coverage of the Voting Rights Act. What it means for what it means for redistricting, especially in the 2020 election and beyond, is that many states are electing legislatures who are going to redraw districts in 2021 for the 2022 elections. Mm-hmm. Now, let's set aside the whole question of whether this year's census is accurate, because we know the Commerce Department has been actively trying to foul it up as much as they can, which puts an interesting decision in Congress's lap next year, whether to accept the results or reject them. But without the protections of the Voting Rights Act, you could have voter suppression. You could have you could have redistricting that is so malapportioned, like in Wisconsin, like in Pennsylvania before their boundaries were redrawn a couple years ago, where a minority party like the Republicans can draw districts in such a way that they can consistently be outvoted by Democrats and yet never have their majority threatened. And how do you do that? You do that by systems called, well, by measures called packing and cracking. You take packing, you take a district with a population that you know is going to vote for a certain candidate or a certain party, and you stuff as many of them into one district as you can. You draw the lines around enough of those people so that whoever runs in that district from that party is going to win by a mile, 80%, 85%. And then it leaves the rest of the territory up for grabs that the party that wants the control can do. And so that's packing. Then you have cracking, which is taking a similar area of electoral strength and diluting it. In Texas about 20 years ago, you had a redistricting plan, well, about 15 years ago, because they redistricted in 2005, where they took portions of Austin and split it into all these districts that ran down to San Antonio about 100 miles away, or up toward Dallas a couple 100 miles away. Mm. And the net effect of it was there were just slivers enough of Austin and Travis County, Texas, that had representation, but had no effective say in electing a candidate of their choice. And that is how low-wage and Black communities specifically affected by redistricting and voter suppression. Their districts are carved up or packed in such a way that if they're fortunate, they have a voice, but not much of a voice. And if they're unfortunate, they have no voice at all. That's pretty much how it operates. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now we don't even have until and unless we get a Congress that reinstates the protections of the Voting Rights Act, especially in those states and localities where they were covered, we're not going to have those protections back again. Yeah.
Well, there's a back end of an observation that we didn't get to earlier that I'd want to use as our last question, as we only have a few minutes. Mm-hmm. How can American society ever truly discuss or comprehend the plight of the working class if concepts like intersectionality, critical race theory, and white privilege are banned from training?
Mm-hmm. And this question goes to the recent executive order about, suddenly a branch of the White House discovered that critical race theory existed, which is akin to 2008, a segment of the news media discovering that Black liberation theology was a thing because Jeremiah Wright, oh my goodness. But how do we ever discuss or comprehend the plight of the working class? It's going to take a large scale effort, and simply put, we're going to have to be able to really face our history. We're going to have to honestly say we have a problem in this country. We have talents, we have capabilities, we have resources that we have been wasting for hundreds of years. And people don't want to talk about that because they're afraid, or because we don't know how to talk about such things. It kind of goes back to one of the first questions about how race appears to be a subject of political discourse now. In some ways, we are talking about race in new manners. The past 5 to 6 years after Ferguson, the realization that the election of Barack Obama did not bring vast improvements to all African Americans, that disparity still exists.
That post-racial notion.
Yeah, the post-racial society. Yeah, right. Okay. There was a moment where we were starting to realize that isn't the case, and we're making progress, but at the same time, we're still stuck in this this toxic practice of looking at Black people as pathologies instead of as people with agency, as people who have concerns, as people who want to do good things for this country, who want to be contributing, who are contributing. So I think if we're ever going to discuss or comprehend the plight of the working class, it's going to depend on how well we can accept these concepts. White House executive orders be damned. And really say, you know, race is at the heart of the American experience. Race is at the heart of all the problems we face. And we've got to be forthright in addressing that. And we've got to be forthright in looking at ourselves and each other as shared participants in this experiment and not adversaries, and not people who are trying to take something away from somebody else. We're trying to get there together. So that's my philosophy.
Well, that's great. We're out of time, and I'd like to conclude by saying a few simple words. But first, thank James Benton for such an enlightened discussion. Thank you, Professor. And I hope we're going to be able to do that again.
Well, fine.
Voting is the bedrock of a democracy, and it is a right that has been obtained through a lot of sacrifice. For workers, the ability to vote for a better life is under assault and is constantly in need of protection. Affordable housing, disability benefits, Medicare, income, living wage protections against environmental racism, and the divestment of long-term health in our community, divestment of long-term wealth in our community, foundationally depend on the right to a true political voice. The right to vote though valuable, may not be the goal, but a means to an end. As Professor Benton said, that's the first step. It's not the last step. And in fact, it's completely in line with what Dr. Kwame Ture, scholar and social and civil rights activist, had said in many a talk, that voting is for a president once every 4 years, while necessary, does not alone complete one's responsibility. The struggle for political change is every moment of every day of every year. One might say, I physically can't commit to every moment of the struggle for political change. Few can say so, but many can learn to discern what is in the best interest and what isn't, then embrace a movement with a common cause. No one person, whether elected or emergent, can change anything in a lasting or significant way like organized movements can. Strength in organization, I believe, is the key. Ture further observed that Martin Luther King Jr. was a great and much needed mobilizer, but it was organization that brought real change in the civil rights movement. And just like it was organization that brought real change in the labor movement. A. Philip Randolph, who I hold in high esteem, I think said it best. At the banquet table of nature, there's no reserved seats. You get what you can take and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization. I'd like to thank you all for participating tonight, and vote tomorrow, and keep your fingers crossed. Good night.
Right.